He mocked her cross necklace on national television, expecting silence, maybe outrage. But what she gave him instead was a moment so raw, so unshakably honest, it brought the entire studio to a halt. This wasn't just a political interview. It became a national reckoning on faith, dignity, and what it means to carry your convictions in plain sight. And by the end of the broadcast, even the man who tried to humiliate her was forced to look in the mirror. And now, if you've ever been judged for what you believe, if you've ever watched someone try to shame a person of faith, then this story is going to stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Tap like if you believe faith isn't a performance, it's power. And subscribe now, because we tell the stories they try to silence. The lights in the Dallas studio of Real Point Weekly always burned a little too bright. Not the kind of warm brightness that welcomes you, but the harsh kind, artificial, cold, sharp around the edges. The air was overly chilled, recirculated through old vents and thick studio insulation, and it hummed with the low whir of expectation, like something unspoken was already waiting to unfold. It was a Tuesday morning, early, but not sleepy. No, this morning was thick with a strange sort of tension. An edge hanging in the air like a thunderstorm was just outside the door. Clayton Ward, the host, sat rigid in his chair, his back ramrod straight, his jaw tight. He wore a navy suit so sharply pressed you could have cut paper with the crease. His tie was knotted with surgical precision, but it wasn't his appearance that made people nervous. It was his smile, or rather, the absence of one. When Ward didn't smile at the start of a taping, producers knew he had something planned. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, composed in a slate gray blazer, her natural curls pulled back neatly, lips painted with subtle grace. She exuded calm, something beyond confidence. The kind of presence that made you stop fiddling with your phone, that made producers straighten their headphones and interns hush mid-whisper. Around her neck hung a thin, elegant cross, gold, delicate, but unmistakable. That necklace had a story, a lifetime inside it. But to Clayton Ward, it was a target. The cameras rolled. The red light blinked to life. The segment was meant to be about education reform, a safe, wonky policy topic that rarely made headlines. But headlines weren't what Clayton was looking for. He wanted a moment, the kind that sparked outrage, debate, views, the kind that didn't just trend, it burned. Congresswoman Crockett, he began, voice smooth like bourbon with an afterburn. Before we talk policy, and here he leaned forward just slightly, eyes glinting. I just gotta ask, that necklace, is that for the cameras, or do you actually believe what that stands for? The room stilled, not froze, not paused. It stilled, like the oxygen had been sucked out, leaving a vacuum of silence so pure, so razor thin, it made people hold their breath without knowing why. 3 seconds passed. 1. Jasmine's eyes flicked to him, unreadable. 2. A technician adjusted the focus, hands trembling slightly. 3. The control room crackled to life with a whisper that wasn't meant for anyone but God. He really said that. The people watching at home didn't have time to brace. There was no delay, no edit. Just the raw, unfiltered question. Smug, biting, tossed like a lit match into dry grass. And Jasmine? She didn't blink. She didn't wince. She didn't even reach for the necklace. She simply let the weight of the moment sit. She let Clayton hang in his own silence, stewing in the assumption that he'd landed a clever blow. And then, after the kind of pause that's more powerful than any punchline, she said it. Not with fury, not with sarcasm, but with a calm so deliberate it sounded almost holy. Is that really how we're starting? Clayton laughed, a shallow, dismissive chuckle. It's just a question. You wear it so often. I figured it was messaging. And then Jasmine spoke, not like a politician, not like someone trying to spin, but like someone who had lived long enough to understand that some truths don't need embellishment. They just need space to breathe. You see a cross and assume performance, she said, her voice steady, smooth as riverstone. I see it, and I think about how I held it in my palm at my grandmother's funeral. I think about the nights I sat on the bathroom floor, shoes off, soul cracked, and whispered prayers that no one else heard. So, if you think that's a show, maybe you've never needed faith just to get through the day. There was no soundtrack in that studio, no dramatic score, but if there had been, the music would have stopped right there, because something bigger had just entered the room. Clayton tried to keep his smirk, tried to regain his footing, but Jasmine wasn't done. People treat faith like an accessory until it's their child in a hospital bed, until it's their parent hooked up to a machine, until the night gets too long and the silence too loud. Then that cross, it becomes more than a necklace. It becomes oxygen. Behind the camera, one of the producers, an older man with decades of taping under his belt, whispered, "Keep the wide. Don't cut away." The cameraman didn't move, couldn't. Later, he would say she looked straight into the lens, like she wasn't just talking to Clayton. She was talking to the people on the other side of the screen. And he was right. Because Jasmine wasn't answering him anymore. She was answering everyone who'd ever been asked to explain something sacred to someone smug. She was answering every grandmother who told her, "Wear it close, child. It ain't for them, it's for him." She was answering the judgment in 1,000 boardrooms, the side eyes in every elevator, the unspoken, "Why are you still wearing that?" from colleagues and critics alike. And then she said, "That necklace? It's not for you. It's not even for them." She gestured lightly at the cameras. "It's for me. It reminds me that I don't have to change for people who wouldn't last a week walking through what I've walked through." And just like that, silence. But not empty silence, not awkward silence, the kind of silence that feels reverent, like a church right before the first hymn, like a courtroom right before the verdict, heavy, sacred. Clayton fumbled for a follow-up, but his voice cracked. "Well, all right then." But Jasmine tilted her head ever so slightly, gave the smallest shrug. "You asked." And the internet exploded. Within minutes, clips were posted. TikToks, reels, tweets, screenshots, hashtags. Some didn't even know who she was before the segment. By the end of the hour, they were quoting her like scripture. By the end of the day, her words were in Sunday sermons. One comment said, "I'm not even religious, but that hit deep." Another, "She didn't clap back, she testifies, and that truth, it slapped." And another still, "That necklace wasn't the story, but her response, that's going to live rent-free in my heart for a long time." But inside the studio, it was quiet. The red light on the camera turned off. The crew didn't jump up like they usually did. No high fives, no cut to commercial relief. Instead, everyone sat still, like they just watched something they weren't supposed to interrupt. Jasmine unclipped her mic with practiced ease, rose slowly, adjusted her blazer, and smiled. But it wasn't a smile that invited conversation. It was a smile that said, "I said what I said." Clayton stared at his notes, suddenly very interested in a blank page. His producer whispered something harsh in his ear, but he didn't respond. Because deep down, he knew. He knew the show wasn't his anymore. Jasmine walked toward the hallway, heels tapping softly against the studio floor. A junior staffer, Declan, 22, tie a little too long, caught up to her, eyes wide. "Ma'am, that was something else." She turned slightly, waited. "My grandma used to wear a cross like that," he said, voice cracking. "She always told me it was her armor." Jasmine didn't say much, just nodded. "It still is," she replied. Outside, her car was waiting. But before she opened the door, her phone buzzed, dozens of messages, a CNN clip already racking up tens of thousands of views. Her aide, Tamika, sent a text. "They're calling it the Cross Interview. Girl, you set the internet on fire." Jasmine looked up at the sky. The clouds were clearing. The morning air was still crisp. She didn't smile for the cameras. She smiled for her grandmother and whispered under her breath, "Told you I'd never take it off." It started as a flicker, a retweet here, a stitched video on TikTok there, a youth pastor in Tallahassee quoting her in an Instagram reel saying, This is how you wear faith, not just around your neck, but in your spirit." By noon that Tuesday, the moment wasn't just viral, it was cultural. A short sentence spoken calmly on live TV had detonated across the internet like scripture in sneakers. People weren't just watching. They were reflecting, reposting, resonating. And yet, while the public response swelled with admiration and solidarity, behind the scenes, the people who ran the show were panicking. Inside the production offices of Real Point Weekly, the mood was nothing like the cool veneer they usually projected. Emails flew like shrapnel. Screens flashed as executives and PR handlers scrambled to reframe, reword, and reroute. The studio's head of public affairs, Julia Debray, sent out a company-wide thread titled simply, "Crockett Incident, Urgent Messaging Guidance." She tried to spin Clayton's question as curious, not confrontational, suggesting language that positioned his comment as a broader inquiry into the politicization of religious imagery in public life. But buried deep in the email thread, Clayton himself had already broken character. His message, sent 37 minutes after Jasmine had left the building, read simply, "Not my best moment. She made me look like I kicked a puppy." One executive replied bluntly, "We underestimated her. Bad optics. We need to shift focus." Another email suggested highlighting past moments where Crockett had been more aggressive in interviews, trying to recast her calmness as calculated. But none of it stuck. None of it could stick. Because what Jasmine had done didn't feel like PR. It felt like truth. And when truth walks into a room uninvited, it doesn't ask permission to stay. By 3:00 p.m., screenshots of those internal emails began leaking online. No one knew who had sent them. But a small anonymous Twitter account called In the Room posted 4 sharp images of the thread, showing the panic, the strategy, the spin. "They're already trying to reframe it," the tweet read. "But we saw it live. We know what we felt." The tweet had over 10,000 retweets within the hour. CNN and MSNBC ran stories about the fallout. Fox called it a media manipulation overreaction, but even they couldn't ignore the noise. People weren't just watching. They were dissecting. In Sacramento, a theology professor named Dr. C.S. Evelyn Shore posted a 3-minute video explaining why the moment mattered. She didn't yell or dramatize. She sat in front of a bookcase, glasses perched low, and said, "The issue isn't that Clayton asked about the cross. The issue is that he expected to trap her with it. And when she answered with grace, with lived truth, it exposed how shallow his question really was. This wasn't journalism. It was a setup. And she walked right through it." Her video hit 1 million views by sundown. Meanwhile, Jasmine was already on a flight to Phoenix for a community engagement she'd committed to months ago. She hadn't even seen the leak yet. In the seat next to her, Tamika sat scrolling furiously through her phone, whispering updates with every swiping motion. The hashtag's trending. Crockett crosses everywhere. Pastors, teachers, heck, even an ex-wrestler turned motivational speaker just quoted you. Jasmine nodded, her expression unreadable, her mind somewhere else entirely. She knew the rhythm of these things. Today you're a quote, tomorrow you're a cautionary tale. But she also knew something felt different this time, not louder, but deeper. It wasn't about her response anymore. It was about what her response had revealed. People weren't rallying because she won a debate. They were rallying because her truth reminded them of their own. That necklace, that quiet moment, it had unlocked something. But she also knew, as she looked out the window at the clouds streaking past, that power never lets a narrative go unchecked, especially when it threatens the illusion of control. By 6:47 p.m. that evening, another internal leak surfaced. This time, it wasn't just emails. It was a recording. Someone inside the network had captured a closed-door meeting between producers and segment editors, discussing how to balance the follow-up coverage and ensure that faith symbolism doesn't dominate public discourse. One voice, clearly Clayton's, was heard saying, "She turned it into a sermon. I asked a question, and now I'm the villain." The recording was raw, unedited, and devastating, because it didn't just reveal their strategy, it revealed their fear. Fear that the moment had gotten away from them, that people were no longer listening to them, that maybe, just maybe, they were watching someone else, someone who hadn't played by their script. And back in Phoenix, Jasmine was watching too. Not the leak, she hadn't seen that yet, but the people, the comments, the direct messages, the emails, stories from strangers. a nurse in Kansas who said she was told to remove her cross necklace at work because it made patients uncomfortable. A veteran in Ohio who wrote about the time he was asked not to look so religious in a campaign photo. A teenage girl from Georgia who had just come out as Christian in a secular household and said Jasmine's words gave her courage. None of them were looking for validation. They were just grateful someone had said what they'd never had the chance to. Later that night, Tamika read aloud a comment that stopped her cold. It was from a pastor in Detroit. "Your necklace wasn't the power. Your stillness was. You didn't argue. You stood. That's leadership." Jasmine sat on the edge of the hotel bed, eyes closed, her phone buzzing endlessly on the nightstand. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even proud. She was still. Like the world had paused just long enough for her to breathe again. But the world didn't stay paused for long. The next morning, headlines shifted. Conservative blogs ran editorials titled "Faith or Showmanship" and "Can Politicians Hide Behind Religion?" One pundit accused Jasmine of using God for clicks. Another said her response was too rehearsed to be real. They dissected her cadence, her tone, her posture. They brought in body language experts to argue that her stillness was strategic. They couldn't disprove her words, so they tried to deconstruct her presence. And in the Capitol, something more insidious began brewing. On the 7th floor of the Capitol Hill complex, a quiet meeting was held. No press, no phones, no transparency. Just doors closed tight and people who understood how to kill a fire, not with water, but with suffocation. 5 party operatives, 2 senior aides from rival offices, 1 high-level donor advisor. A screen in the corner displayed the paused frame of Jasmine's viral moment, her cross necklace glinting in the light, her gaze locked straight ahead. "She's turning into a symbol," one aide said, arms crossed. "A martyr we didn't ask for." "No," said another. "She's turning into a narrative we don't control." That was the problem, not her religion, not her tone, but her control. She had taken a moment designed to embarrass her and turned it into something that breathed, something people carried with them. That made her dangerous. And in Washington, dangerous women, especially ones who don't apologize, rarely go unpunished. Laurel Kinsey, a strategist with a reputation for quiet takedowns and steel glare politics, stood from her chair. "We've seen this before," she said. "They get a mic, then they get a following, then they become untouchable. We don't let this one become the message." One young aide looked up. "So what do we do?" Laurel's response was surgical. "You pressure. You isolate. Quietly. You make her an island." And so it began. That afternoon, Jasmine's name was removed from a bipartisan panel she'd been invited to weeks ago. No explanation, just a new email with new guests. A think tank in New York postponed her appearance indefinitely. A Republican senator who had quietly praised her after the incident now stopped returning her staff's calls. No statements, no backlash, just absence. The kind of cold silence that doesn't make headlines, but kills momentum. A drip-drip of invisibility. Back in D.C., Jasmine sat in her office with Tamika, reviewing the week's schedule when the phone rang. It was Alethea Morin, an old friend, a former law professor, now an ethics advisor to a liberal watchdog group. She didn't waste time. "Jazz," she said plainly. "They're circling. I've already heard from 2 donor boards whispering about you being divisive." Jasmine sighed. "For wearing a necklace?" "No," Alethea answered softly. "For refusing to apologize for wearing it." That night, Jasmine stared out the window of her D.C. apartment, the Capitol dome glowing in the distance. The city looked peaceful from that height, but she knew better. She knew the difference between noise and danger. This wasn't outrage anymore. This was strategy, and it didn't just want to shut her up, it wanted to erase the conversation entirely. But Jasmine wasn't interested in playing defense. The next morning, she stood behind a podium in Flagstaff, Arizona, for what was supposed to be a minor town hall meeting. But word had gotten out. People showed up in droves, not just to hear her speak, but to be in the same room as someone who reminded them of themselves. She didn't open with talking points. She didn't even open with policy. She said, "Last week, someone asked me if this necklace was a show. I told them it wasn't. I told them about my grandmother. I told them about the nights I prayed alone. But what I didn't say is this. She leaned in. Faith is only performative if you're pretending. I'm not pretending, and I'm not backing up, just because someone else got uncomfortable with what keeps me grounded. The room went still, not because people weren't listening, but because they were remembering something of their own grandmother's stories, their own whispered prayers, their own moments of quiet conviction. And then, something small happened. A woman in the back, early 60s, eyes full, stood and said, "Say that again." So Jasmine did. They didn't call it a takedown. That would have been too honest, too visible. They called it balancing the conversation, providing full context, ensuring neutrality. Words that looked harmless in emails and press statements, but when sharpened behind closed doors, became scalpels designed to carve someone's legacy into something more manageable. Jasmine didn't know it yet, but the smear machine had already been activated. And this time, they weren't aiming for the fire she lit. They were aiming for her reflection in it. It began slowly, like a shadow at dusk, creeping, quiet, hard to define. Headlines began shifting subtly. What had once said, "Crockett silences host with powerful response," now read, "Jasmine Crockett's cross moment sparks debate over faith and public service." On the surface, they seemed fair, balanced, but the tone was changing, no longer admiration, just doubt. Beneath every title was a question mark. Beneath every question mark, a silent suggestion. What if she's using this? The spin wasn't about what she said anymore. It was about what she meant. Pundits on morning shows began speculating whether she had staged her stillness, rehearsed her reaction. One even accused her of weaponizing sympathy. They played her answer on loop, not to praise it, but to pick it apart, frame by frame, word by word. Another network brought on a retired communications expert who said, "Her pauses were too perfect, her tone too modulated. That's not authenticity, that's branding." By the end of that week, a segment ran on a major network titled "The Rise of the Preacher Politician." It featured side-by-side footage of Jasmine's calm studio moment and fiery sound bites from speeches she'd given during her early campaigns, years ago when she was younger, louder, still finding her voice. The contrast was jarring by design. The implication was clear. This isn't who she really is. They played her own growth against her, as if strength only counted if it stayed messy. They even found an old clip of her on a college panel at Prairie View A&M, talking about the tension between private belief and public identity. She was 21 in the video, voice slightly shaky but filled with resolve. "I'm tired of being told to check my faith at the door," she had said. "I'm tired of people who've never had to pray for rent telling me I'm too loud about what saved me." The clip was short, raw, real, but it was spliced into a longer segment that questioned whether Jasmine could be objective if she wore her faith too visibly. One anchor asked, "Can someone who sees their necklace as armor truly legislate for a diverse America?" Jasmine didn't flinch. She'd seen it coming. It was an old tactic. Make the person the story, twist their motive, then cast doubt until their message drowns in suspicion. Still, it stung, not because she was surprised, but because of how easily the lies took root. Tamika, furious, paced the office. "They're not even pretending to be subtle anymore," she muttered, waving her phone. "Look at this. This PAC ad says you want Bibles in every classroom and sermons in every Senate session. None of it's true, and they know it." Jasmine didn't respond right away. She was sitting by the window, watching fog roll across the Capitol dome. "They don't need it to be true," she said finally. "They just need it to feel messy." And then, on Monday morning, the envelope arrived. Thick paper, no return address, sealed with a mark she hadn't seen in years. Tamika spotted it on her desk when she walked in and immediately felt a cold weight drop in her stomach. She didn't even have to open it to know. Jasmine walked in seconds later, still sipping her coffee, and stopped when she saw Tamika's face. "What?" Tamika didn't speak. She just pointed. Jasmine picked it up, slit the flap cleanly with her nail, and unfolded the letter. 3 pages, neatly typed, legal font, cold and impersonal. But the accusation cut hot. An official complaint had been filed against her with the House Ethics Committee. The charge? inappropriate use of personal religious symbolism in federal spaces, potential violation of the Establishment Clause, suspected leveraging of religious identity for political advantage within government proceedings. It didn't accuse her of breaking any specific law, just of crossing an invisible line, the kind of line that shifts depending on who's watching, the kind that had never been drawn when senators swore oaths on Bibles, when presidents quoted scripture in inaugural addresses, when chaplains led prayers on the floor of Congress. But somehow, when Jasmine wore a necklace and answered a question with lived truth, that was suddenly a bridge too far. Tamika's voice cracked. "This is manufactured." Jasmine handed her the pages. "Of course it is." The worst part wasn't even the content. It was who filed it, anonymous on paper, but it had to be internal. Someone from the Hill, someone who wanted a paper trail. Because ethics complaints don't require proof to hurt. The process was the punishment, and within hours, it leaked. 3 outlets ran the story by nightfall. Crockett under ethics scrutiny for cross-necklace controversy. Not alleged, not accused. Just bold, declarative language that lumped her truth in with scandal, corruption, misconduct. She wasn't under investigation for embezzlement or lying or violating the public trust. She was under scrutiny because of a necklace. A necklace. By Tuesday, the chill had spread. Allies who once applauded her began to go quiet. Scheduled interviews were postponed. Invitations reevaluated. Donors reassessing. Even some fellow congresspeople avoided eye contact in the halls, not out of malice, out of fear. Because in Washington, nothing is more dangerous than someone who refuses to apologize when they're told to. Jasmine kept working. She attended hearings, she asked questions, she showed up. But every move now felt like it had a target painted on it. Every smile analyzed, every silence dissected. Commentators debated whether her poise was defiance or delusion. One headline read, "Is Crockett's calmness a cover for extremism?" And still, she didn't flinch. 2 weeks later, she was invited to speak at a university event in Charleston, West Virginia. She almost declined. But something inside told her this one wasn't just about her anymore. She arrived at a modest auditorium on a drizzling Wednesday evening, expecting a half-full room of policy wonks. But when she walked in, the room was packed. Students lined the walls. Faculty sat on folding chairs. In the front row sat a little girl, no older than 10, with braids and a tiny silver cross around her neck. Jasmine saw her immediately, and something inside her shifted. She walked up to the podium, notes in hand, and then she set them aside. No speech, no bullet points. Just a voice, clear, steady, and carrying something heavier than policy. "They filed an ethics complaint," she said, not with bitterness, but with clarity. "Because I wore something that means something to me." She scanned the crowd. "But they didn't ask if I'd ever used my faith to deny someone their rights. They didn't ask if I'd weaponized it to silence dissent, because they know I haven't. What I wear doesn't threaten the Constitution. It threatens the illusion that you can erase identity and still call it fairness." The room was still, so still it felt like it might crack. She looked at the girl in the front row and smiled softly. They didn't do this because they fear the cross. They did it because they fear what happens when someone refuses to hide it. Afterward, the little girl tugged on Jasmine's sleeve. "I wear mine," she whispered, "because it makes me feel brave." Jasmine knelt down, met her eyes, and replied, "Me too." Back in D.C., 10 days later, the complaint was quietly dismissed. No press release, no apology. Just a footnote buried in procedural updates. The silence that had been used to isolate her now tried to bury its own error. But the damage was done, or so they thought, because what happened next wasn't orchestrated by a strategist. It wasn't funded by a PAC. It didn't come from a party or a think tank or a spin room. It came from someone no one expected. The very person who'd started the storm, Clayton Ward. It happened on a Thursday night. His podcast, Ward Unfiltered, usually aired once a week, full of sharp one-liners and partisan chest thumping. But this episode was different. No guest, no intro music, just Clayton sitting alone in a dimly lit studio with a plain background and a single mic. He looked older, more tired than usual, no makeup, just a man and the weight of his own choices. I've been thinking about that interview, he began, voice softer than anyone had ever heard it, and about what it did to people, to me. He paused. I asked a question I thought was clever, thought I was going to pin her down, maybe embarrass her, maybe expose something fake. He looked away from the camera for a moment, then back. But she was the realest person in that room. People screen recorded it before the live ended. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. Clayton leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. We toss around words like values and integrity, but when someone like Jasmine Crockett actually shows up with both in plain sight, we get nervous. Or worse, we get petty. He didn't say the words, "I'm sorry." He didn't need to. She made me look at myself, and I didn't like what I saw. That sentence, it hit the internet like thunder. It was clipped, posted, reposted. By noon the next day, it was on every platform, CNN, Fox. Even the shows that had previously dogpiled on Jasmine were running segments titled Ward's Unexpected Confession. Some said it was damage control, others said it was growth. But most said the same thing. It meant something. Because most people don't change course midstream. Most people double down. But humility, real, unscripted humility, is hard to fake. Jasmine was in Kansas City that day, speaking at a youth organizer roundtable when someone showed her the clip on a phone. She watched it in silence. When it ended, she handed it back and said, "If that's real, it's a start." That night, she posted a single tweet. Truth makes people uncomfortable. Growth starts there. It wasn't a mic drop. It was a door, an open one. And for a brief moment, it felt like something shifted again. Not in politics, but in the air. Because for all the noise, the smear, the silence, and the spin, one thing remained undeniable. Jasmine never raised her voice. She never begged to be believed. She simply stood in her truth and let the world catch up. It began, as movements often do, not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper, somewhere far from Washington, far from the media chatter and legal jargon. In a small public school district in Beaumont, Texas, the board met late one Thursday evening under fluorescent lights that hummed like tired insects. The agenda at first glance was dry: policy revisions, budget allocations, community concerns. But buried on page 5, between cafeteria contract renewals and textbook reorders, was something quietly explosive. A proposed restriction on the visible display of religious symbols in public classrooms. The language was slippery, crafted to sound neutral. It claimed to protect educational spaces from external influences and uphold inclusive learning environments. But parents and teachers who read between the lines saw what it really was: a soft muzzle. Cross necklaces, yarmulkes, hijabs, any visible sign of faith would be subject to removal for the sake of uniformity. Okay, when word leaked ahead of the vote, the community didn't react with protests or fire. It reacted with presence. Families packed the boardroom. Teachers stood against the back wall in solidarity. A father wearing a faded Veterans of Foreign Wars cap stood silently next to his daughter in a church youth hoodie. A mother with a Star of David pendant brought homemade cookies for the security guards. They didn't chant. They didn't shout. They simply showed up. The first voice to rise came from a middle-aged woman named Terry Mason, a single mom, 4th grade teacher, and lifelong Texan. Her voice shook as she approached the podium, her small silver cross catching the fluorescent light. "You say this is about neutrality," she said, "but it feels like shame. You're not asking my students to think freely. You're asking them to hide the parts of themselves that help them survive the hardest days of their lives. That's not neutrality. That's erasure." She wasn't the only one. A boy with braces stood next. He looked no older than 16, his yarmulke resting slightly crooked on his head. "If I take this off," he said, "I'm not being respectful. I'm disappearing." A video clip of that meeting made its way online by the next morning. Edited together by a local journalism student, it began with the school board chair fumbling with the mic and cut quickly to those testimonies, the teacher's voice cracking, the teenager's conviction, and finally, one looping phrase from a pastor's closing remarks: "We don't fear their beliefs. Why are you afraid of ours?" It should have ended there, just another meeting in a town few people outside of Texas could place on a map. but someone stitched Jasmine Crockett's original TV interview over the footage. Her words, calm and crystalline, played on top of those testimonies. You see a cross and assume performance. I see it, and I remember whispering prayers no one else heard. The video exploded. Within a day, it had over 1 million views. Teachers began sharing it in staff groups. Church leaders forwarded it in email blasts. Mothers posted it between recipe links and daycare photos. It wasn't about Jasmine anymore. It was about recognition. People didn't see her. They saw themselves, their families, their daughters, their students, their grandmothers. By Saturday, the video had reached national news. The cross connection, they called it. And suddenly, Jasmine was back in the headlines, not for a legal complaint or a viral clip, but for what had grown around her without permission, something quiet, persistent, and impossible to contain. Jasmine didn't fly to Texas. She didn't call a press conference. She didn't ride the wave. Instead, she sat in her apartment and watched the video alone. Not because she didn't care, but because she cared so much she didn't trust herself to speak yet. She saw the faces in that video. She heard their pain. And she knew this wasn't about defending her anymore. It was about protecting the permission her words had accidentally granted others. Tamika entered the room with a laptop in hand, already mid-sentence. Okay, look at this. This mom in Omaha made t-shirts that say, "Not performance, survival." And a church group in Ohio is playing your quote during Sunday school. She paused. You've become the sermon. Jasmine didn't smile. She just said, I didn't ask to be. Tamika sat across from her and leaned forward, serious now. You didn't ask to be. But that girl in the front row in West Virginia, she needed you to be. The next morning, Jasmine posted a video from her couch. No glam team, no press lighting. Just her, wrapped in a sweatshirt, natural hair tied up, and a voice filled with something unmistakable. Fatigue, truth, and unshaken clarity. When I spoke about my necklace, I didn't plan it. I didn't practice it. I just answered a question with what was real for me. And now I see. That real made some people uncomfortable. But real also gave other people something to hold on to. Something to stand in. That's not my doing. That's the power of truth. It echoes. She paused, looked into the camera. If you're a teacher being told to tuck your faith away, I see you. If you're a student afraid to wear your necklace to school, I see you. If you're a parent trying to raise kids with faith in a world that calls it outdated, I see you, and I'm not going anywhere. The comments section flooded instantly. But what mattered more than the comments were the calls. Pastors, school board members, retired teachers from Montana to Mississippi. They weren't calling to ask for help. They were calling to say thank you, to say, we've started writing our own letters, to say, you gave us words we didn't know we needed. And then came the letter from Selma Beck, a retired music teacher in Indianapolis, 84 years old, widowed. The note was hand-typed, mailed with a forever stamp, and arrived in Jasmine's office in a simple white envelope with trembling cursive that read, to the woman who didn't back down. Fame. Inside it said, I wore my cross under my collar for 38 years because I didn't want the principal to accuse me of preaching. But every day before the bell rang, I touched it, just to remember who I was. You reminded me that faith doesn't have to be hidden to be sacred. It can be both seen and lived. Thank you for standing when so many of us had learned to sit quiet. Jasmine kept that letter, folded it twice, slipped it behind her desk photo of her grandmother. And while the people moved, the system wasn't done fighting back. On Monday, Jasmine's Wikipedia page was edited 3 times in 2 hours. Anonymous users added lines about controversial remarks during past campaigns, citing contextless quotes from years earlier. One edit falsely claimed she had supported removing religious iconography from public spaces, completely opposite of the truth. Another twisted a policy she'd debated into a claim that she wanted to merge church and state. None of it was accurate. But on the internet, damage doesn't have to be truthful. It just has to be fast. Tamika slammed her laptop closed. They're doing it again, the machine. Jasmine, sitting quietly with Selma's letter in her hands, whispered, they want people to stop hearing the truth and start doubting the messenger. Tamika nodded. Exactly. They want to drown your truth in noise. but the noise couldn't quite reach the people on the ground. At a diner in Amarillo, an older man, gray beard, MAGA hat, coffee mug in hand, told the waitress, "I didn't like what that host said to her, but I respect how she answered. That's what you teach your kids. That's character." In Portland, a school teacher put up a poster in her classroom, "Wear it, mean it, stand in it." She didn't name Jasmine. She didn't need to. The students already knew. That week, a high school in South Carolina hosted a student-led Symbols of Strength Day. Kids wore crosses, stars, crescent moons. Not to divide, but to say, "We're here. All of us." One girl wore a tiny mustard seed charm and stood at the mic in front of her classmates. She said, "I wear this because it reminds me that I'm more than my fear. And if people like Congresswoman Crockett can wear theirs and not fold, maybe I can too." Jasmine saw the clip on Instagram and whispered one word, "Amen." It was never about the necklace. Not really. It was about what it stood for in a world trying to erase everything it couldn't control. And now, that symbol, simple, gold, passed down from a grandmother who whispered prayers into generations, was being printed on posters, painted on murals, and worn again with pride, not as protest, as presence. At her next town hall in Tulsa, the crowd brought their own chairs. The church basement overflowed into the sidewalk. An elderly man handed Jasmine a small velvet pouch after her speech. Inside was a weathered crosspin. "My wife wore this for 52 years, he said, voice cracking. "She passed last fall. But she would have loved you. She would have said, 'Finally, someone speaking in the voice of the old truths.'" Jasmine held the pin like it was sacred, because it was. She didn't ask to lead this movement. She didn't plan to become a symbol. But symbols, like seeds, bloom in soil they never chose. And this one had roots. There's a moment in every storm where the wind shifts, not enough to end it, but enough to signal that the worst is no longer coming. It's already here. That moment came for Jasmine on a cold Friday morning, when a manila envelope, hand-delivered and sealed with the insignia of the U.S. House Judiciary Subcommittee, landed on her desk like a gavel. Inside were preliminary findings from the now-closed ethics complaint. Though formally dismissed, the report hinted at concerns about precedent-setting behavior regarding religious symbols and advised Congress to consider guidelines to ensure ideological neutrality in public representation. Bisoam, it was, in essence, a quiet blueprint for future censorship, an attempt to write new rules, using her as the cautionary tale. Tamika read the document 3 times and finally muttered, "They're trying to silence you through policy now, not accusation, legislation." Jasmine said nothing at first. She just looked out the window again, the Capitol dome barely visible through the mist, and whispered, "They're trying to end what they couldn't control." That night, a major conservative news outlet aired a primetime special titled "The Faith Agenda: When Belief Becomes Branding." The entire segment centered on Jasmine. They pulled her college speeches, her town hall moments, her quote about faith being survival, and sliced them into something unfamiliar. The host called her dangerous. "This isn't about a necklace," he warned viewers. "It's about power, cloaked in righteousness." Shh. They brought on a guest who claimed Jasmine's presence in Congress was proof that personal religion is now being weaponized against the secular state. They even questioned whether her calm demeanor was part of a long-term strategy to create cultural division. Jasmine didn't flinch. She'd seen this strategy before: strip someone of their humanity, replace it with suspicion, then watch them get erased. But what her critics didn't realize was that the country was already moving with her, not away from her. The story had outgrown the narrative they tried to assign it. The next morning in Baton Rouge, a 6th-grade teacher named Marie Langston recorded a 2-minute video on her front porch. It wasn't polished. Her phone wobbled. The audio crackled, but her voice was clear. "I teach kids who don't know where their next meal is coming from, who don't know if their mom's going to make it home. And sometimes the only thing they hold on to is that cross around their neck or the psalm in their pocket. I don't care what the committee says. What Jasmine said wasn't politics. It was pain and truth, and it was ours." The video got 5 million views in 2 days. In Phoenix, a mural of Jasmine appeared overnight. Spray paint on a brick wall near a church food bank. No name, no text. Just her profile in calm defiance and a golden cross resting over her heart. Volunteers took photos. Kids stopped to stare. That Sunday, across the country, pastors, rabbis, and imams all referenced her moment in some way. Not to elevate her, but to point towards something she'd unlocked, that in a nation obsessed with performance, stillness was power. And conviction, quietly spoken, was still a storm. But while the public embraced her, the political backlash reached its sharpest point yet. On a Wednesday afternoon, Jasmine received an invitation to testify before a joint committee hearing on faith, neutrality, and the role of symbols in government discourse. The title was sterile. The motive wasn't. It was a televised hearing, a stage meant to rattle her, to bait her into overstepping, to clip and splice her responses and use them in campaigns and think tank white papers. Tamika didn't want her to go. Neither did several allies. "They want you to lose your cool," one advisor warned. "They want to poke until you swing. Then they'll say you're the threat." Jasmine took a long breath. "Then I won't swing. I'll stand." And stand she did. The chamber was packed, cameras perched like vultures. The committee chair cleared his throat and opened with a loaded preamble, calling the moment a discussion on the dangers of blurred lines between personal faith and government messaging. Then he turned to Jasmine and asked the question no one had dared say aloud before. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you believe your cross necklace entitles you to speak with moral authority over your peers?" She didn't blink. She didn't smile. "No," she said calmly. "My necklace doesn't entitle me to anything, but it reminds me not to lie to myself when others ask me to." A hush fell. "I don't wear it to impose anything. I wear it because it's a part of me. Just like the scars I don't hide, just like the truth I don't water down. I didn't ask to make it political." "You did." Some on the panel looked uncomfortable. Others looked impressed, but no one interrupted. "I have never silenced anyone for not believing what I believe. I have never used my faith as a weapon, but I have used it to survive. And if that makes you nervous, good. Maybe that means it's working." By the time she stepped out of the chamber, reporters swarmed, but she didn't stop for a soundbite. She just walked, silent but unshaken. That evening, she returned to her office and found a voicemail waiting. A woman's voice, older, slightly raspy. "My granddaughter came home from school crying because they told her to take off her necklace. We showed her your video. And she said, 'I'm keeping it on. Jasmine Crockett wouldn't take hers off. Thank you.'" Jasmine sank into her chair and finally let herself exhale. It was never about popularity. It wasn't about party lines. It was about presence, dignity, staying rooted when the world tried to rip her up. Weeks later, the committee hearing had faded, but the ripple had not. A new resolution passed quietly in the House, a reaffirmation of individuals' rights to reasonable personal expression of belief, provided it does not disrupt official duties or impose upon others. It didn't bear Jasmine's name, but everyone knew who had carved it into existence. She had stood, not shouted, not wept, not postured, just stood. And across the country, thousands stood with her. In nursing homes, small churches, inner-city classrooms, suburban basements, prisons, and lunch counters, people who had hidden pieces of themselves began to let them be seen again. Some put on their old cross necklaces. Others wore the Star of David or the crescent moon. Some didn't wear symbols at all. They just stood a little taller, knowing someone out there had faced the machine and didn't bow. Back home, Jasmine placed her grandmother's cross back in its wooden box for the first time in weeks. Not because she was done wearing it, but because she'd finally bought a new one. The original would stay in a safe place now, a relic of a moment that turned history's page. And as she clipped the new chain around her neck, she smiled. Not for the camera, not for the headlines, not even for the country. But for the little girl she used to be, the one who sat at her grandmother's feet, whispered prayers with unsure words, and once asked quietly, "Can I be both strong and faithful?" The answer had come, and it was louder than she ever imagined. In a time when silence is expected and conviction is branded as defiance, Jasmine Crockett stood still, not to win, not to trend, but to remind a weary nation that quiet faith, real faith, can still shake empires. It can still bend microphones. It can still stand without screaming. And sometimes it wears a cross. If you believe no one should be silent for their faith, if you believe courage can be quiet and truth can be worn like armor, click that like button, share this story, and subscribe to our channel. Because in this community, we don't just watch, we remember, we reflect, and we rise. Let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you ever felt pressure to hide your beliefs? What gave you the strength to stand? And see you in the next videos of Charles Stories, where justice speaks.